Imagine you're the pilot of a Bell 407 helicopter. Not long after takeoff, you notice the helicopter begin to yaw to the left. You apply right pedal, expecting the nose to come back, but nothing happens. You push harder, still nothing. Fortunately, at cruise speed, the vertical stabilizer helps keep the helicopter under control, but the pedals seem to have zero effect on yaw. For the moment, you have plenty of altitude, and as long as you maintain your airspeed, there isn't an immediate danger. But you know one thing. Eventually, you're going to have to slow down to land. After a second or two of disbelief, reality sets in. You're dealing with a serious in-flight emergency. You've lost all tail rotor control. What would you do? Hello and welcome to Helicopter Training Videos. In this video, we're going to look at actual cockpit footage of a Bell 407 pilot dealing with a loss of tail rotor control emergency. But before we watch how this story ends, I'd like you to think about what you would do in this same situation. And to keep this discussion focused, let's make a few reasonable assumptions. Let's assume the helicopter remains controllable at cruise airspeed. You have plenty of altitude, and there's an airport within range. We'll also assume that you've declared an emergency, air traffic control is helping, airport fire and rescue vehicles are standing by. Finally, there are no other system failures, no severe vibrations, or other flight control problems forcing an immediate landing. Those assumptions let us focus on the real question: how do we safely get this helicopter back on the ground? So, what would you do? Option 1, get to the airport and enter an order rotation. Option 2, get to the airport and make a running landing to the runway. Option 3, something else. Pause the video if you like, think about your answer, and let me know in the comments. What would you do? Before we watch the landing, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about something I think is really important. When I started researching this video, I reached out to a number of other pilots with 407 time to get their thoughts, and thanks to everyone who took the time to speak to me. Among the group, there wasn't an immediate or obvious consensus on a single best course of action, and even with the assumptions we made, almost every answer started with the same two words. It depends. And I actually think that's the right answer. So if you chose option 3, because you wanted to learn more about what the helicopter was going to do before committing to landing, I think that's a very reasonable approach. One thing the FAA talks about is the hazardous attitude of impulsivity, the quick, do something attitude. And we probably know the antidote: not so fast, think first, etc. Applied to this scenario, right now we have altitude, we have airspeed, we have time. So instead of rushing into a landing, I'd want to learn as much as I safely could about what the helicopter was likely to do as the airspeed and power changed for landing. There are three main things influencing the helicopter's yaw. First, the main rotor torque. The Bell 407 has a counterclockwise or American-style rotor system. For helicopters with clockwise rotor systems like the A-Star or Cabri, everything discussed in this video regarding torque would be reversed. Anytime the engine is driving the main rotor, torque reaction is trying to rotate the fuselage in the opposite direction. In this case, that means trying to yaw the nose to the right. The more power we use, the stronger that tendency becomes, and vice versa. Second, the vertical stabilizer. The Bell 407's large vertical stabilizer has its leading edge canted outboard by 9 degrees. As airspeed increases, it produces an increasing left yaw tendency. But at low speeds, the aerodynamic effect diminishes completely. Third, tail rotor thrust. Normally, we control the tail rotor thrust with the pedals, but obviously not in this case. We know the pedals aren't affecting the helicopter's yaw, but we don't know yet what the tail rotor itself is doing. It may still be producing some anti-torque thrust. It could be producing enough thrust to yaw the nose left. It might be producing almost no thrust at all. Or it could even be producing negative thrust, adding to the helicopter's natural tendency to yaw right during powered flight. And it gets even more complicated. The tail rotor pitch may change with changes in airspeed and RPM as the aerodynamic forces acting on the tail rotor change. It's the tail rotor thrust variable that I would want to better understand before committing to landing. Unlike a stuck pedal emergency, we can't simply look at the pedal position and know approximately what the tail rotor is doing. So I'd have some detective work to do. If I had the altitude available, I'd probably make some careful and small changes in airspeed and power to see how the helicopter reacted. Not huge changes, just enough to learn how the helicopter is likely to behave as it slows for landing. Will the nose your left, your right, or remain roughly centered? The answer to that question will determine my landing technique. In doing this in-flight detective work, I'd have to be very careful to stop any yaw before it developed into an uncontrolled spin. By maintaining safe altitude, say at least 1,000 feet, I could push forward on the cyclic to regain airspeed, bringing the vertical stabilizer back into play, and then reassess. If the helicopter started yawing to the right, despite increasing airspeed, I could also lower the collective to reduce the torque reaction while I still had plenty of altitude. The goal at this point isn't to solve the problem, the goal is to understand the problem before committing to landing. Okay, enough theory. Let's watch what the pilot actually did. We don't know what detective work the pilot did before the video starts, but they decided to make a run on landing. See that smoke on approach? We'll come back to that. They maintain a good amount of airspeed all the way to touchdown. And then, as the helicopter slows, you can see a slight yaw to the right develop as the vertical stabilizer's left turning effect diminishes with decreasing airspeed. And on approach, you can see smoke that seems to indicate a slight right crosswind, which may have also added to the right yaw. It all worked out really well. Great job by the pilot. It doesn't appear the pilot manipulated the throttle until the movement had stopped. If the right yaw had become worse, or if there had been concern about sliding off the edge of the runway, a slight reduction in rotor RPM using the throttle may have helped bring the nose back to the left. And that leads into a simple memory aid I use when teaching and practicing tail rotor emergencies in American style or counterclockwise rotating rotor systems. Lower equals left, raise equals right. What I mean by that is lowering either the collective or the RPM will generally make the aircraft's nose yaw to the left. Lowering left. And raising the collective or raising the RPM will generally make the nose yaw to the right. You can even use the index finger of your throttle hand as a reminder. As I roll the throttle up or raise the RPM, my finger points to the right. As I roll the throttle down, or lowering RPM, it points to the left. Remember, if you're using this technique before ground contact, lowering rotor RPM also reduces lift, causing the helicopter to descend faster, and lower RPM too much, and you risk stalling the rotor system completely. Oh, and if your helicopter does not have throttle control on the collective lever itself, maybe it has overhead throttle controls or a fuel flow control lever on the floor, well, that takes the throttle control option off the table for a single pilot crew. And there's one more complication. For certain tail rotor thrust settings, at touchdown you may need to combine raising the collective while simultaneously lowering the RPM. Lowering the RPM reduces the main rotor lift, the tail rotor thrust, and the torque reaction, allowing the helicopter to settle while also changing the yaw forces. Raising the collective increases lift and cushions the landing, but also increases the torque reaction. The challenge is balancing those two control inputs to keep the helicopter aligned with the direction of travel as it settles onto the ground. It's important to also remember that this is just one possible technique. There isn't a single solution that works for every tail rotor emergency, and this definitely isn't something you're going to be proficient at by watching a YouTube video. These are skills that should be practiced with an experienced instructor in a simulator or the aircraft. But why did this emergency happen in the first place? According to the person who sent me the video, this was a maintenance test flight as work had been performed on the tail rotor, but the tail rotor control linkage did not receive a duplicate inspection after the work was completed. This part of the tail rotor control linkage is normally hidden beneath the fairings, making it difficult for a pilot to inspect during a normal pre-flight. As you can see, without using something like an inspection mirror or a cell phone, it is almost impossible to get a good look at this connection. During pickup and takeoff, when significant left pedal input was required, the linkage was pushed against the bell crank connecting bolt, allowing the tail rotor to function as expected. However, once the pilot tried to apply right pedal in cruise flight, the linkage moved away from the bolt and the tail rotor control was lost. These kinds of maintenance errors are fortunately pretty rare, But while researching this video, I found 2 other Bell 407 loss of tail rotor control accidents that occurred in the past 3 years. The first occurred on June 4, 2022 in New Jersey. The pilot had about 870 hours of helicopter time, but only about 30 hours in the 407, all of it within the previous month. He completed 5 hours of Part 135 flight training in the aircraft before being released to fly the line. So he was still relatively new to the 407. His training records also indicated that tail rotor emergencies had been covered as a ground discussion only. About 5 minutes after departing Caldwell Airport, the pilot, who was the only person on board, was heard on the cockpit recorder repeatedly saying, left pedal, before finally asking himself, what is going on here? The pilot requested to return to Caldwell Airport. When the controller asked if he needed assistance, the pilot declined and did not declare an emergency. Instead, he simply said that he might need the runway. The controller cleared him to land on the numbers, runway 28, which the pilot accepted. As the helicopter slowed down below 30 knots on approach, it entered a rapid right yaw and completed several full rotations before impacting the ground beside the runway. Fortunately, the pilot survived, although he suffered serious injuries. The NTSB determined that 2 bolts securing the tail rotor crosshead drive plate were missing, and according to the NTSB, were likely not installed following maintenance. The tail rotor had been installed the previous day by the Director of Maintenance. Another mechanic had inspected the work, and a maintenance pilot had completed a pre-flight inspection along with 3 ground runs before the helicopter's return to service. The accident occurred on the first flight after the helicopter was returned to service. During the investigation, the Director of Maintenance reported being interrupted several times while performing the installation to assist with repairs on 2 other aircraft. The NTSB final report concluded that the helicopter remained controllable while it stayed above effective translational lift because the vertical stabilizer and improved rotor efficiency continued to provide directional stability. However, as the pilot slowed for landing, the increased torque could no longer be balanced because of the loss of tail rotor control. The report concluded that a run-on landing maintaining airspeed above effective translational lift would likely have provided greater directional stability and increased the chances of a successful landing. Another Bell 407 loss of tail rotor control accident occurred on August 1, 2023 in South Carolina. The helicopter, operated by a sheriff's office, had just undergone maintenance at Sumner County Airport and was being flown back to Charleston International Airport. This pilot had more than 3,000 hours of helicopter time, including over 300 hours in the 407. About 35 minutes into the flight, the pilot noticed the helicopter beginning to yaw to the right, and pedal inputs made no difference. To quote the pilot, "It felt as if the pedals were not attached." The pilot set up for a shallow run-on landing on runway 15 and crossed the threshold at about 20 feet above the ground when the helicopter began an uncommanded right yaw. The pilot lowered the collective, remember lower equals left, but the right yaw continued. The pilot then lowered RPM by rolling down the throttle, but went all the way to idle, effectively entering auto rotation. The helicopter impacted the ground with a high rate of descent and came to rest on the grass beside the runway. The NTSB determined that one of the bolts securing the tail rotor pitch change lever assembly was missing, while the other was loose and missing its required cotter pin. The NTSB probable cause was a failure of the tail rotor pitch change lever assembly due to incorrectly installed bolts and maintenance personnel's inadequate inspection of the tail rotor control system. One takeaway I have from all 3 of these accidents is that once I'm committed to a run-on landing, I'd personally rather get the helicopter as low as practical while maintaining airspeed, ideally around best rate of climb if I want to preserve any chance of a go-around, and then adjust airspeed while maintaining at least ETL before touchdown, and then if I do have to close the throttle at the very end to control the right yaw, I'm already close to the ground and there's much less opportunity for the rate of descent to build up before impact. Now let's look at what the Bell 407 flight manual says. Right up front it tells us something important. There is no single emergency procedure for all types of anti-torque malfunctions. It also says, one key to a pilot successfully handling a tail rotor emergency lies in the ability to quickly recognize the type of malfunction that has occurred. Like I discussed earlier, it's all about understanding the problem before committing to a landing. In the New Jersey accident, the pilot didn't declare an emergency and accepted a land on the numbers clearance, suggesting they may not have yet realized the seriousness of the situation. If I suspected any sort of tail rotor problem, one of the first things I'd do is make some deliberate pedal inputs to help recognize exactly what kind of malfunction I was dealing with. Some helicopters, like the AW119, have a dedicated emergency procedure for a total loss of tail rotor control that essentially calls for an auto rotation. The BAL 407 is different. Its flight manual doesn't contain a procedure specifically addressing a total loss of tail rotor control. Instead, the closest guidance is the fixed pitch failures procedure, which BAL describes as an inability to change tail rotor thrust with the anti-torque pedals. The procedure lists two indications. First, a lack of directional response, and second, locked pedals. Although the pedals weren't locked in these accidents, this is still the closest manufacturer guidance available because the pilots had effectively lost the ability to control the tail rotor thrust. The procedure goes on to recommend noting the power or torque and airspeed, explaining that certain combinations of airspeed, torque, and RPM can correct the yaw, and that those combinations should be used to complete the landing. Like we talked about earlier, you're trying to understand how the helicopter is reacting and then work out which combination of airspeed, power, and RPM gives you the best control during set down. If you've never practiced anything like that in the helicopter or a simulator, that's a lot to work out for the first time during a real emergency. The procedure also calls for pulling the pedal stop emergency release to ensure the pedal stop is fully retracted. That would not have made a difference in these accidents because the problem wasn't a restriction in the pedal travel. The procedure is then divided into three situations: hovering, in flight with left pedal applied, and in flight with right pedal applied. Without reading the entire procedure verbatim, the guidance that most closely matches these accidents is probably the in-flight stuck right pedal procedure, which is representative of cruise flight or reduced power situations, as BAL puts it. In that situation, BAL recommends a run-on landing while reducing the throttle or lowering the RPM, as necessary to maintain heading as the collective is raised to cushion the landing. That's the balancing act that we were talking about earlier. Lowering the RPMs tends to bring the helicopter nose to the left, while raising the collective tends to yaw it to the right. There's also a reduction in tail rotor thrust with the RPMs decaying, which also kind of plays into this a little bit as well. The flight manual doesn't specify a recommended airspeed for run-on landings, but like I said earlier, once on final approach, I'd personally stay around best rate of climb speed until I was close to the runway. That gives me the best chance of a go-around if I need one. Then for this scenario, once I'm committed to landing, I try to touch down above effective translational lift because slowing below ETL requires a significant increase in power. That changes the yaw considerably and increases the workload of balancing the helicopter's heading with the throttle and collective. But as we've discussed throughout this video, it all depends on what the tail rotor thrust is actually doing. And if the right yaw becomes excessive, BAL directs the pilot to close the throttle completely. If you do end up closing the throttle completely before touchdown, you've essentially transitioned to an auto rotation. And as I said, I'd rather be close to the ground when this happens so the rate of descent has little opportunity to build before touchdown. It's also one more reason to practice hover auto rotations or simulated power failures in a hover with a little forward movement, not just from a stationary hover. Although these accidents were not caused by stuck pedals, without any manufacturer-specific guidance for a loss of tail rotor control, stuck pedal training is one of the best ways to prepare for this type of emergency. And like any emergency procedure, reading the steps on paper is one thing. Actually balancing collective RPM and airspeed, trying to maintain control while descending towards a runway, is something else entirely. Some simulators, like the one we have, allow us to simulate not only stuck pedals and loss of tail rotor thrust, but also a complete loss of tail rotor control, like in these accidents. That is an excellent way to safely experiment with different techniques and gain a better understanding of how the helicopter might respond. It's also exactly the kind of training that the US Helicopter Safety Team promotes through HSE 123, which is encouraging pilots to use simulators to rehearse high-risk scenarios. The NTSB also for a long time has made similar recommendations because many emergency situations simply can't be fully practiced safely in the aircraft. Another challenge with this type of emergency is there's so many variables. The helicopter's weight, the center of gravity, density altitude, wind conditions, availability of a runway, and the specific make and model can all influence which technique gives you the best outcome. That's why there isn't one simple answer that fits every situation. Running through different scenarios in a simulator or in the aircraft with an experienced instructor, or even mentally, couch flying, helps build a toolbox of ideas and skills that you can draw from if you ever had this kind of emergency. I've made a couple of videos over the years covering stuck pedals and other tail rotor emergencies in the R-22, and Randy Rolls from the Helicopter Institute has an excellent video demonstrating stuck pedal procedures in the Bell 407. I'll put a link to all those in the description below. Just before we wrap up with some key takeaway points, I wanted to explain the origin of this video. The entire video came about because of the foundonpreflight.com project that I started earlier this year. Alpha Kilo submitted the Bell 407 loss of tail rotor control video showing what happened in Papua New Guinea over 10 years ago, along with photos of the control linkage that had been disconnected and what pilots should be looking for during pre-flight. That's exactly what Found on Preflight is all about, sharing real photos and videos of things found during pre-flight inspections so we can all learn from them and become better, safer pre-flight inspectors. Sometimes one submission leads to a much deeper dive into a topic, so thank you again for sending that in and starting me down this rabbit hole. If you'd like to learn more about pre-flying your aircraft, or if you found something interesting during a pre-flight inspection, whether it's a photo or video, please visit foundonpreflight.com and share your findings. And if there's an accident, incident, or an aviation topic you'd like me to look into for a future video, you can also send it through the contact page at helicoptertrainingvideos.com/contact. Okay, what are some takeaways from all of this? It appears all three of these accidents resulted from maintenance errors. Remember, even experienced mechanics with secondary inspections can make mistakes. We're all human. If maintenance has recently been done on your aircraft, know exactly what has been done and give those areas a little extra attention during your pre-flight inspection. Use a flashlight and a pre-flight mirror to inspect those hard-to-see areas. They can reveal problems that would otherwise go unnoticed. If something doesn't feel right with the pedal response, don't rush into landing if you have other options. Maintain airspeed and altitude if you have them, and use the time available to better understand what the helicopter is doing before committing a course of action. If you're dealing with an emergency, declare it. Keep no secrets, get ATC involved, have the airport fire and rescue standing by. That's good crew resource management. And if I end up with something like a stuck pedal or a loss of tail rotor control, and I decide a run on landing is the best way to go, I'm going to make sure I get as low as possible to the runway before slowing down. I think as an industry, we spend a lot of time practicing auto rotations, but not nearly enough time preparing for the many other emergency situations we can face. If you have access to a simulator, use it, and spend some time with an experienced instructor working hands-on through the many varied emergency scenarios in the aircraft. And finally, knowledge is safety. Keep reviewing the flight manual, especially emergency procedures. It's hard to predict how you'll react with the startle factor of an actual emergency, but the more familiar you are with the emergency procedures, the better prepared you'll be. Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts, experiences, and techniques in the comments below. I'm looking forward to the discussion. A huge thank you to all the YouTube members and Patreon supporters helping to support this project. Supporters at different levels get perks including early releases, priority replies to comments, access to the Discord server, and exclusive member-only videos and shorts. Also, check out the Helicopter Training podcast for episodes on getting started, choosing a helicopter flight school, financing a training, learning to hover, and more. Find it here on this channel under the podcast tab, or search for Helicopter Training Podcast on your favorite podcast player. You can also keep learning on this channel with playlists covering ground school subjects and flight maneuvers, or follow along with a student on every training flight from day one to check ride. If you haven't already, please subscribe to get the latest videos and help support this channel. And for more helicopter resources including articles and quizzes and how to support this project, visit helicoptertrainingvideos.com. Thanks for watching. Fly safe.